עכשיו תפקידי האחרון הערב זה להציג את הדובר האחרון שהוא השגריר של האיחוד האירופי בישראל, והזמנו אותו א' משום שהוא ידיד טוב של המכון, ודבר שני משום שזו כבר הפעם השנייה שלו בישראל והוא כבר ותיק במחוזותינו, ודבר שלישי הוא שרת במשלחת האיחוד האירופי, השגרירות שלהם בניו יורק לאום, ולכן הוא ראה את הסיפור הישראלי באום מהצד של מייצג גוש גדול של מדינות באום. עמנואל ג'ופרה, בבקשה ותודה רבה שבאת. הוא הבין מה שאמרתי.
Thank you very much, Oded. It's a pleasure to be at the Institute. It's a topic that is not necessarily an easy one for European diplomats before Israeli crowd. I am sure that you've heard a lot of interesting discussions by the distinguished panelists before me. And as Oded was saying, I think the reason why you've been asking me to come today is because I had the opportunity and I think the great chance to serve in Israel and in the United Nations. And I took a flight from Tel Aviv straight to New York. That was in 2007. So I was coming from 4 years in Israel, and I went through a very interesting time, as always is the case in Israel. I remember the disengagement plan from Gaza. I remember the Second Lebanon War. I remember the takeover of Gaza by Hamas and many other things. And I understand, I think, the difficulty that sometimes the Israeli diplomats face in New York. I would say that certainly there are at least two orders of difficulties. The first one is the methods. The United Nations is the place where things are always said indirectly, and you have to grasp it. There's a very polite way of doing diplomacy, particularly in the General Assembly. And I think the directness of the diplomacy here is certainly of a different style. And this one has to adapt to this new environment, and it was difficult for me after 4 years in Israel, so I think it certainly was a challenge for an Israeli diplomat. But I think the main challenge is for the Israeli diplomats is, in my view, is that the way the United Nations functions. The United Nations is made of its member states. It's the reflection of what the member states are, and it's not a perfect organization. There are a lot of shortcomings. I would say that two of the main shortcomings are that the United Nations produces a number of instruments, layers, geological layers of decisions that tend to deep to the ground and remain. It's relatively easy to create something, it's very difficult to dismantle it. So as the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has been at the center of the UN, because the UN was there with the creation of the State of Israel from the very beginning and was linked to it very intimately, this is something has produced a number of bodies, resolutions, and habits, and what at the United Nations they call agreed language. Agreed language is the magic word of the United Nations. What is agreed is holy, so you cannot change it. It stays and it tends to remain for decades. So this is certainly one of the difficulty and one of the shortcomings of the United Nations, this difficulty to reform itself and look freshly to the new situation. And the second difficulty that I think is certainly there for an Israeli diplomat is the fact that the United Nations work, and I think we heard it now with the panel of the distinguished ambassadors, works by blocks. Member states do not look to issues, particularly in the General Assembly. I think my experience was mainly in the General Assembly. They don't look at things nationally, but often as a group. This is important for member states because they need to have friends in the United Nations to protect themselves. So you had a number of groups that have been created the non-aligned movement that you heard before, the G77 looks mainly at economic issue, the Africa group is very important, and these political groups are really the engine of the United Nations in the GA. Much more than geographical groups that exist, the Eastern European, the WEOG, the Asian group, etc. The European Union is a group as well. We have created a group, but we are a little different from others because we have a system of coordination that forces everyone to take a position on a certain issue. And this, I think, for Israeli diplomat provides also a mechanism to interact with the EU. The Israeli diplomats are extremely capable in creating channels to communication with the EU member states and in Brussels and the United Nations as well. So the EU works in a more sort of structured manner. We have position papers, we discuss issues, etc., etc. But the other groups tend to work under the leadership of one or two countries, depending on the issue. So that's one or two countries, 3, 4, 5 that are having the leadership tend to take the whole group in a certain direction. And I think this is where the difficulty for an Israeli diplomat certainly is. And I would say these are the two of the main shortcomings that the United Nations has. And as European Union, we want to be able to address those shortcomings because I think here the problem is that we need to be careful not to throw the baby with the bathwater. And this is the challenge that we're all facing as international community. The United Nations is there also to provide a framework to address certain key issues that affect all of us, not only on security matters, but also on environmental issues, economic issues. And it's very important that this organization is there. You probably heard before me the Special Coordinator of the United Nations, Ambassador Mladenov, and what he does, for example, Mladenov for Israel at the moment, in the context of the Gaza situation, is I think, an important task. And the fact to have someone you can call upon to address a security issue that we have all witnesses, including the ambassador here, I think is something that has great values. The same thing can be said about UNIFIL up in the north. UNIFIL again is not perhaps the perfect mechanism, but it provides guarantees, a tripartite mechanism to be able to sit down with the Lebanese armed forces, a presence on the other side of the fence. It's a mechanism that certainly helps, like UNDOF in the Golan, now that even after the decisions of the US to recognize the sovereignty of the Golan, the decision was maintained to keep UNDOF also by the US, because it's a buffer, serves a useful purpose. And I would add, and I'm sure that I'm not saying something that has the unanimous support of the room, I think UNRWA, with all its shortcomings, is also something that helps to maintain a certain stability in the region. So I'm just giving a few examples to say that the United Nations is doing something useful for Israel as well. And I always seen the Israeli diplomats in New York, and I always been impressed by their capacity to navigate in a very difficult environment, sometimes hostile. Certainly the relationship between people at the UN in New York can be very good, but the politics is always there. And Israel is not part of one of this big group, and I think this is one of the issues that makes Israel a unique case in the United Nations system. It's part of the WEOG when it comes to for elections purposes. Israel has a lot of friends, but it's not necessarily part of one of these driving groups that set the agenda, that make the decision. In the General Assembly, Security Council works in a slightly different manner, but this dynamic certainly is reflected also there to a lesser extent. So, in my view, the Israeli mission, the way they operated was to do their best in difficult circumstances. I've seen great diplomats walking the rooms, walking the corridors, establishing a relationship with Europeans, but also non-Europeans, and trying to advance. And I think this is an important element that I don't know whether it was debated, but in my view, Israel, despite all the difficulty that I've been facing in the United Nations context, they never gave up in promoting certain priority on agriculture, on the use of technology, and I think this is a very important thing that Israel has been doing, trying to bring its best achievement to the United Nations, and despite all odds, bringing its contribution to the organization. And I think in this, Israel has found many allies. Of course, there's always this group dynamic that has to be overcome. Certainly very much appreciated by Europeans. And I think it's the intention of maintaining the integration in the organization and the contribution of the organization that is there and has to be maintained. I think that you probably had a long day, so I don't want to say much more than what I said. But the message from the European Union is that a rules-based system remains the objective, remains important for everyone, because whenever we move out of a rules-based system, might make right, and everyone is left on its own. So if we have the protection of a system as imperfect as it can be, we are all better off, because the challenges we're facing are all beyond the forces of the strength and force and the capacity of one single member state. Certainly Europe, the single European states are unable to address them, and we need to get together, and I think that Israel in many areas would require the same sort of support. So thank you for inviting me. I hope that my contribution was useful.